Stand up for righteousness. Stand up for justice. Stand up for truth.
I truly believe that thoughts are the greatest vehicle to change.
We do not care whether the cat is black or white, as long as it can catch mice.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
The journey is long, the road is dark and frightening, but together we can reach our destination, the Tasmania of which we all dream, where all are welcome and all prosper, is a quote by the Tasmanian writer, often recognised as one of the greatest living novelists and poets, Richard Flanagan. I thought this was an apt quote for our guest today, a self-described, proud and passionate Tasmanian who led Tasmania with distinction for 6 years as its 45th Premier. Our guest today is the Honourable Will Hodgman. Born, raised and schooled in Hobart, Will completed a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Laws at the University of Tasmania before entering private practice in Hobart, specialising in criminal and personal injury law. Following a year and a half working in Wiltshire and southwest England, Will returned to Tasmania, where he was elected to the Tasmanian Parliament in 2002 in the electorate of Franklin in his early 30s. Will was then elected Deputy Leader and after the 2006 election was unanimously elected as Leader. Although the Liberal Party failed to win government in a hung parliament in the 2010 election, under Will's leadership, the Liberals won government in 2014 with a large swing against the incumbent Labor government. Will led the Liberal Party to another victory in 2018 before deciding to leave politics for family reasons. Since leaving Parliament, Will has served as the Australian High Commissioner to Singapore. Will has also been the Chair of the Australian Business Growth Fund and is the Principal of Hodgman Partners, which advises a range of government and business groups. Hello and welcome to another episode of No Limitations, a show where we speak to elite world-class performing men and women and unlock the secrets and influences that have shaped their destinies and that you could apply to your own life. For our first-time listeners from all over the world, please don't forget to follow on your preferred podcast platform and share with your friends and colleagues. And for our listeners in Australia, Singapore and the United Kingdom, a big hello. I am your host, Greg Robinson, Managing Partner of Blenheim Partners, Board and Executive Search Firm. In a compelling discussion, Will explains his start in life in Hobart, growing up in a family with an illustrious history in Liberal Party and Tasmanian politics. He recounts how he spent his school holidays in Canberra, where his father was a federal parliamentarian, brushing shoulders with Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser in the back corridors of Parliament. Reflecting on his tenure as Premier, Will sheds light on not only the major achievements of his government, but also some bitter disappointments. Will recounts the intense spotlight of hosting Xi Jinping in Hobart in 2014, whereby Tasmania and China agreed to greater economic ties that substantially boosted growth for Tasmanian industry. Will describes this as happier times for the Australia-China relationship, and he offers some salutary lessons for Western democratic governments in establishing a constructive relationship with China. Through his tenure as High Commissioner to Singapore, Will shares his observations about the enormous opportunities for Australia in Singapore and Southeast Asia. Lastly, from the inner sanctum, Will contends that Tasmania and Australia should seek a more ambitious reform agenda. To me, Tasmania has a very special place in my heart, so sit back and enjoy Meeting in a Telephone Box. Will, welcome to the show.
Great to be on the program, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Hate to come at you so hard, Will, but low productivity in Australia, slow economic growth, a lot of uncertainty out there. But gee, we're funding in Tasmania, aren't we? When's it going to stand up on its own 2 feet?
Very predictable question from a mainlander. I reckon, seriously, you should have a closer look at your nearest neighbours, Victoria. Have done very well out of the GST. Western Australia, who have made billions out of it and squandered a lot of it. I mean, at the risk of sounding immodest, during my time as Premier, we took Tasmania's economy from the worst performing in the country to the best. GSP.
Was that per capita, or what do you mean by that?
Yeah, across several key indicators. Gross state product, our population growth returned after people were finding reasons to leave Tasmania more than to stay. Unemployment rate dropped to the national average or below. We employed a lot more people. There's 50,000 more employed now in Tasmania than when my government came in back in 2014. So we did a lot to turn Tasmania around. We opened up the place for investment. We made our natural resources more productive, and Tasmania more open to investment. And we literally made Tasmania the turnaround state. So we stood on our own feet. But GST and our federation...
Did you stand on your own feet?
Yeah, absolutely. We got our budget back under control. We made some tough decisions. We had to reduce the size of the public service. That brings with it some challenges and a big fight with the unions, but we needed to do that. When we came into government, there were deficits forecast as far as the eye could see. We returned our budget to surplus, and as I say, we turned Tasmania's economy from the worst performing state in the country to the best.
Okay. Well, what is the future for Tasmania then?
I think, look, it has its challenges. It's a small state, and the point I was going to make about the GST is that it ensures that wherever you live, in the smallest state to the largest, you're able to enjoy the same, as best you can, as best as the Federation can provide, services and quality of life. So for a small state like Tasmania with a population of 570,000, we've got a disadvantage in terms of our population base, our income earning capacity. We need to use our resources well, and that includes not only our natural resources like our forest industry, our renewable energy generation capability, but also Tasmania is a tourism destination of choice for Australians, but also people across the world. So that's why we needed to increase access and provide more reasons for people to visit Tasmania, because our visitor economy Tasmania is the most reliant on its visitor economy, its tourism industry of any state in the nation. So we need to invest in that.
Who comes to Tasmania?
Well, back in my day, over 1.3 million people a year for a population of 570. It's a large number of visitors, and a lot come from interstate, New South Wales and Victorians.
Oh, really?
But also a large number of international travellers. We used to get a lot more from China, and certainly a lot from Asia and America. The US was another large source.
And where do you see it now, Will? Is it trading in that sense in the tourism at where it should be? There's room for opportunity?
Yeah, we need to stay ahead of the pack. We've had enormous growth in recent years due to a number of pivotal circumstances. The visit of President Xi Jinping to Tasmania back in 2014.
That was a interesting one.
Incredible. It was early in my time as Premier.
Game changer?
Yeah, absolutely. Happier times in the Australia-China relationship.
Yep.
I was lucky not long after becoming Premier in 2014 to meet President Xi. Then Prime Minister Tony Abbott took a delegation, every state Premier, hundreds of our business and industry leaders to China for Australia Week in China. And I was fortunate enough with all the premiers to meet Xi Jinping at the Great Hall, and we were told you've got 45 seconds to make an impact, so choose your words carefully. And I think I said more than once, you must come to Tasmania. And by then, he had been to every other capital city in Australia, which is a lot more than most Australians, I suspect.
Yes.
And he hadn't then been to Tasmania, where, ironically, he was formerly governor of the Fujian province, which is Tasmania's sister province. So there was a neat synergy, and sure enough, November that year, he came to Tasmania. It was an extraordinary event, catapulted Tasmania's economic projections in agriculture, tourism, international education. It was pivotal, and it was certainly a key part of the turnaround.
You've also been the Australian High Commissioner to Singapore. What's the three sort of key points, insights, takeaways we think not just as Tasmanians, but as a nation we could take on board?
I think enormous opportunity in Southeast Asia, and our governments, successive, have identified the fact we need to do more in trade and investment into Southeast Asia. Singapore's the perfect hub. It's our closest partner in Southeast Asia and an easier market to penetrate and to launch from into neighbouring ASEAN countries. It's the fastest growing region in the world. It's our closest neighbour. It's important to us not only for trade and investment, but also for defence and security, and important people-to-people connections as well through cultural exchange, education and tourism. So I think we really need to sharpen our focus on Southeast Asia, and that is happening. That there's plenty of opportunity there because Australia...
Are we good in Southeast Asia? Will, you've seen it from the other side. I lived in Hong Kong. Are we good?
No, a lot more to do.
And are we trading as a nation, or are we trading as separate states and territories?
Yeah, certainly. I had to have a mindset shift when I went to Singapore, having been Premier of Tasmania, and there on a number of occasions representing that state. When I got there, I was representing our federation, but each and every state and territory has an office in Singapore, as well as Austrade, our National Trade and Investment Commission. So there's that healthy federation competition that we're used to at play in Singapore. Sometimes it can be helpful, and it's certainly, I'd never discourage any particular jurisdiction doing its best to attract investment to their own state or territory. But sometimes it does conflict with the national agenda.
What about the mindset, Will, of the Singaporean politician versus the Australian politician? And you can even start at the fundamentals. Just look at the compensation differential and the quality as a result. So I'd be interested in your perspectives there. Yeah,
best paid politicians in the world. I was often told if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. And that may be true. If you look at the composition of the Singaporean parliament, it's filled with exceptional people. And look, they have advantages there. If you could wipe the slate clean in Australia, you might look at their system, single House of Parliament. Here we have 3 tiers of government across the country. It causes confusion, duplication. In Singapore, a cynic might say, no real opposition to speak of. The media less disruptive, and certainly social media plays less of a role disrupting the course, the mission that Singapore and its government are on. Yeah. Now, there's a lot of downside to all of that as well, and I'm saying this a little tongue in cheek, but what it does allow them is to plan for the longer term. They'll outline a long-term, multi-decade vision, which rarely happens in Australia because it would get smashed to bits.
We can't get past the next election.
Exactly. Yeah. And longer electoral cycles there, a lot more stability.
4 or 5 years?
5.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of sanity in that?
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the disadvantages of the Australian system of government is 3-year or thereabouts federal election cycles, way too short.
Yeah.
4 years in state was as short as you'd want, in my view. In Tasmania, in my case, I think it does us a disservice. It leads to little less time for incoming governments to get up to speed, and before you know it, we're back in election campaigns, and that can certainly stall progress that's being made.
Pay peanuts, get monkeys. All right. So do you know what the average sort of compensation is in Singapore? For a minister?
Yeah, well, look, certainly the Prime Minister, I think well over $1 million.
That's right. I think a lot of the ministers are close to that as well.
Yeah, and a lot, to be fair, have taken massive pay cuts. A lot come from the private sector or government agencies, defence, military, or have run one of the big corporations or one of the big Singaporean entities there. So they do get well remunerated, but then to go into Parliament, they're taking a pay cut.
So the logic, get smart people,
experienced
people, and don't be corrupted.
Yeah, and they're being challenged as a developing, maturing political democracy. There's now a recognised opposition party. The media is a lot more critical than it's been. There have been recent instances of, if not corruption, maladministration or integrity issues, which Singapore has not previously had to deal with. So, as I often spoke with ministers in Singapore about, I think it's a natural evolution of a growing parliamentary democracy, which is only close to 60 years old now. So, I think it's inevitable, and it'll be part of what they need to encounter that up until now has been less disrupting of their nation's progress, which has been incredible. Literally taking an island in a swamp.
Yeah, it was a swampland, wasn't it?
To
naval backyard, wasn't it, for the
one
Brits?
of the most successful economies in the world.
Well, you're a former politician, so I'd be silly if I didn't ask you around this great skill. Our audience is chief execs, chairmen, NEDs, entrepreneurs, and all of them have one aim, which is to communicate the message, to engage and get people to be inspired to follow them. Politics, Ronald Reagan was probably the best as the great communicator. What could you sort of share with us in the sense, what is the art of the communication? Now, how do you get that message? Is it just short and repetitive? Is it, how do you play it? Because you've won, you've lost, you've seen the game at its best, and you've probably seen it at its worst. What would you like to suggest there?
Yeah, I think authenticity is key. There's no doubt that you have to keep your message simple.
Really, from politicians, authenticity?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're not, you get caught. And I've got recollections of where if my heart wasn't in it, you'd get tripped up, and people would work that out. I learnt that very early. A simple message that's clear. It does need to be repeated, whether we like it or not, and it may not need to be a 3-word slogan, but you do need, according to marketing experts, to repeat your message 7 times at least. We were told, and
that's right.
For it to the 7 message rule to sink in. But I think that sense of conviction and clarity and authenticity is absolutely essential. But it's becoming increasingly difficult with social media.
Yeah, I was going to say, what's your view around that?
Yeah, well, and again in Singapore, where they have a less tolerant view to the information that can be disseminated through their community, and there are ways that they will look to monitor that, because it can impact with democratic processes. We've seen that in Australia. It can be a source of serious disruption to civil society. It can.
This also can be, as you say, very false as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
It can be very dangerous. So
fake news.
Yeah,
as some people say, right?
Yeah, and echo chambers. Where people are fed just a single source of information that doesn't allow them to explore critical thinking or alternate views. There's a lot of downside to it. So how political organisations and businesses can break through that and get some clear air has become increasingly challenging. So authenticity is critical, because if you get tripped up, you lose that trust and confidence, and people will stop listening.
Okay. The breakfast table, the dinner table, the lunch, was it always politics at home? It's a pretty illustrious sort of pedigree and family you've come from.
Yeah, unusual family background, with father, uncle, grandfather all in parliaments at various stages, including my father for a time with
you
me.
Together, yeah.
Yes, which was made things complicated, you might say, but. No, politics wasn't really. I think because it was such a part of our lives. We were normalised or desensitised, I guess, to political life. I grew up with election campaigns off and on, with the media attention that comes with a political life. Seeing the good side of a political career as well as the downside, I have to say. But my dad was in Canberra initially, as well. He prior to that, he was in Tasmania's state parliament, but then went to Canberra to our national parliament. So it was away often, but we also then spent a lot of time in Canberra. Our family holidays were often a trip to Canberra. I'd be running around the old Parliament House unaccompanied, bouncing into Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser and getting lost in the Senate building. And, that was our sort of playground. We grew up like that. And as I say, it sort of desensitised us because I was never daunted or overwhelmed by being around political leaders. I understood and respected who they were, but it was just part of our life. And having a grandfather and uncle also in Parliament at various stages only made things worse.
Did you think you were going to follow the sort of the footsteps of members of the family?
It wasn't something I wanted to do until I'd lived overseas.
Okay.
That was a catalyst in my mind. It was always something people thought might be a natural progression. It was in my DNA, but I only ever firmly decided upon that after returning to Tasmania from the UK, where I'd lived for a couple of years in the late 90s.
Okay. Before we get that far, you do the classic politician. You study law.
Yes.
Gee, the place is full of lawyers, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a few, and it doesn't hurt because I think it's a good. Okay,
it's
basis.
good for the wordsmith, and it's obviously passing law and everything else. Do we need to change a bit of the dynamics and the percentage in Parliament?
Yeah, well, more women, definitely.
Yeah, but irrespective of that, I can talk, but diversity of thought can come from different backgrounds and sense. Businesses, we've got a policeman, ex-policeman as the leader of the opposition. You got someone who's run small business, but we don't. We have a lot of lawyers, and I'm sort of wondering, is that the best outcome for the good? You guys are great to debate, but is there enough real life experience before you walk in those sort of corridors of power?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, diversity is great. The people will decide ultimately as well. So it's.
I'm deliberately throwing it at you because I just look at it all day, every day, and you say, right, okay, there's another one. Come out of law, all right, done a few years. Suddenly they're going to get up and give us all the experience that God's given them, and there's a lot of quality people who won't even entertain the idea of going into politics for obvious reasons. It's invasive, doesn't necessarily pay well. Never stops. You don't get to see the family. So are we going about it the right way? These are Singaporeans paying, circa $1 million. And what are we paying? $250, $350. What's the PM on? $450, $500? It's not, okay, yes, they might have a few free trips as a result, but it's not enormous pay.
No. And
not for the sacrifice.
Absolutely not. And, I think, I'm a very firm believer in our democratic processes, and I commend anyone who puts their hand up for Parliament because it has a lot of downsides, as you say. There's a lot of upside to it, though, as well. Enormous privilege, responsibility, opportunity, and very challenging, rewarding career if you're lucky enough to win a seat. Diversity is important. I think, having a legal background brings a lot of advantage, but I ran my own practice as a sole practitioner, as a barrister, set up my own.
Oh yeah, you're your own business person as a result. Yep.
I don't want to stretch that too much, but I brought my own experiences with me. I practiced law representing legal aid clients predominantly in criminal proceedings.
Yeah, criminal, wasn't it? Yeah.
And in the UK, prosecuting cases of child abuse. So I wasn't your classic corporate lawyer from, what's it, Surrey Street? Is that? wherever, or even Collins Street, Hobart. I'd worked in a quite different stream of legal practice. So I think I've brought different perspectives as a result of that.
Right. What changed the mind when you're travelling overseas or living overseas? What was it? Just a bigger and broader perspective and giving me the I'm going to do something with my life mentality, or what?
Absolutely. I left Tasmania, beautiful place, small community, closely connected.
Hobart boy through and through?
Yep.
Okay.
And comfortable, safe and fortunate. Good education, good schooling, safe, close family.
Yep.
Went overseas. That's always, in my view, a great way to open your eyes. I did so on my own, went through the United States, then to the UK, well-trodden path.
What years were we talking about, Will?
So this is late 90s, after a few years practicing law in Tasmania. It's a natural...
This is when Mr. Blair might have been just about coming in?
Absolutely, yeah.
New Labor's just on...
Yep.
Okay, right.
Yeah, and I watched very closely what he and the New Labor were doing to revitalise their nation, albeit as a Labor politician.
Yep.
A lot of what he did, I took with me when I became leader of the Liberal Party in Tasmania, because it was transformative. A lot of which he did, I would not agree necessarily, but he was pragmatic, modernised his party, and really, reinvigorated Britain and England, and Cool Britannia was a thing. When I was there, it was an incredible time of national pride, and Blair invested a lot into changing his party to make it more relevant.
Yep.
It had been on its knees, as mine was, when I became leader of the Liberal Party in Tasmania, and I took a lot from that experience, that you can turn the sentiment, the mindset of a nation or a state.
Well, what do you
around.
think? Okay, you're living in the UK. I was there at the same time. What do you think the Palmers were looking for? What were they wanting?
I think a lot of hope and optimism. They've been through a really, really tough time.
So it was Major, wasn't it? Did he replace Major?
Yeah. And they, there'd been conservative governments in power for a long time, very difficult circumstances as well, and the nation had to shake itself off, what were quite bitter and divisive times. And that's not a reflection on either political party necessarily, but what Blair did cleverly was say that his party could play a more constructive role in bringing the nation back together, and they did that with 3 successive victories. I mean, there's a lot, you can point to that was not so good with the Blair governments, but they did a lot to transform England and Britain. Blair did a lot in Northern Ireland, for instance. Yep. He did a lot culturally. He did a lot to restore a sense of pride in the UK. So it was, quite an instructive.
And did you enjoy working there and living there?
Yeah, very much so. I lived. I deliberately chose to live outside London because a lot of my friends, contemporaries who'd been there, never left. And they saw very little of Britain as a result. So I moved down to Bath, just a couple of
Beautiful
hours.
Part of the world.
Magnificent World Heritage City. Went down on my own, had a mutual friend from Tasmania who got me a job working for the Wiltshire County Council, budget larger than Tasmania's, by the way, and county councils there run schools, highways and roads, do trading standards, effectively the same as state governments here in Australia. And I joined their legal team, and I think literally on my first day of work, having been a barrister in Tasmania, working in the court system there, they thought I'd be the ideal person to represent the county.
Well, you're going to be Rumpole, are you?
Well, they were looking for somebody to go to court and to be their barrister, and I had experience, and off I went on day one, but prosecuting child abuse cases. So it was a really confronting experience. And not only would I appear in court, but I'd often assist social workers who went into communities, into homes of cases where abuse or neglect had been alleged, to be part of not only the criminal justice side of dealing with those situations, and that's where I came in, but also supporting children who were in urgent need of care and often were required to be taken from an unsafe environment. So for me, and this is what was pivotal in getting me to consider what role I might play when I returned to Tasmania, was seeing the importance of an effective public service and a childcare agency and institution in the UK that would protect the most vulnerable. It made me realise that, of course, this sort of thing happens in Australia. Of course, there are far too many victims who are not appropriately or adequately protected by the state, let alone their own families. So it motivated me to look a little closer into what I could do when I returned home to help make my home, my state, a better place and a safer place. And that was a key in making me realise that, I had an opportunity, and sure, there was a family connection, well-known political family. I was well placed to win a seat. I never underestimated that nor took it for granted, but there was an opportunity that I wanted to take.
2002, early 30s, right age to enter politics?
For me, and I wouldn't dare presume to know what it would be like for others, but for me, I wouldn't have wanted it to be much younger. I'd had that experience abroad, but, I went into Parliament, perhaps a little naive or fresh-faced and with fresh ideals.
It's not a bad thing, is it?
No, but you learn very quickly that
idealists don't survive, or
no, and it's not
it's about pragmatism.
Well, absolutely, yeah, and that was a cornerstone of what I applied to my own personal career in politics, but also to leading our party. That what works is what matters in politics. Idealists, fine, but if it's not actually achieving something or helping progress in some way, then it's not doing much. So I learned very quickly that compromise isn't a bad word in politics. You need to compromise. You need to listen to other people and to understand different perspectives and balance that up against your own before making decisions or taking positions. And I'd rather be pragmatic than dogmatic.
You also had the benefit, from what I've read, you had a number of portfolios during your early days. That helped you somewhat?
Yeah, and not by choice. Tasmania's parliament is so small that typically the Premier has to take on a number of ministerial portfolios as well to share the load. So it was important to me as Premier, head of the state service effectively, or the minister responsible for the state service, to also take on portfolios that were important to our government. There are obviously key ones like health and education that I felt required the dedicated attention of a particular minister. But in my case, I took on ones that I had a passion in and that I felt needed some attention from the highest political level.
And you became deputy leader relatively quickly, from what I've read as well.
Day one of getting elected.
You don't mess around.
Well, that was a byproduct, though, of our party being decimated. We were smashed at the 2002 election.
How can the party be so decimated? Why can't they hear? Why aren't they listening?
Yeah, it lost its way. We'd been in government only back in the late 90s, so it wasn't that long, but we were reduced.
Booted straight out. Booted out hard, too.
They used to say we could meet in a telephone box. We were that small. There were only 7 of us, and
Is that right?
It was me and my old man, so that made up 2. So that, as I say, made things complicated. My father actually defeated the then leader of the Liberal Party in his own electorate. So it was a tough time, but not a bit like shares, not a bad time to buy in at its lowest because the only way is up. But I perhaps back then didn't appreciate how long a grind it would be in opposition, but it was a great training ground, a great apprenticeship. By the time we got to government, we were ready, but it was a long, hard slog. Absolutely.
So you came in, 202? You made, with leader 206, is that right?
Yep.
Okay, so you served your 4 years. How many of you? Seven of you in the team at that time?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're now leader. You got the 10, all right. Yeah, because that's right. You did quite well. How were you doing? How were you getting your message out? Because you did get a swing. It was all very positive in bringing new blood in. Well, why am I going to listen to you? What was the catch cry?
Yeah, it was a fair question because I think the general conclusion was that we were not able to govern ourselves. So how could we govern the state?
Good question, yeah.
Yeah, and people worked that out. So they were prepared to listen once we demonstrated some credibility in managing our own affairs, building trust, I had 8 years as opposition leader, which some claim is a national record, but there are other examples, not many. You often don't get 2 terms in opposition because there's this short attention span, the need to keep recycling leaders. But we committed, and I had the support of my deputy, who's now Premier of Tasmania, my treasurer, who became Premier of Tasmania after I left, and the rest of our team, that whatever happened, we were going to stick to our plan once agreed. We were going to stick with our leadership once agreed.
Come on.
We did.
That's always subject to results, isn't it?
Well,
we agreed that, bearing in mind you're a good leader up to the night, or the numbers we're seeing, or what the polls are telling us. You know, you can seriously trust your fellow colleagues, can you?
There were plenty of bad polls in that time.
So how do you get them? Because you think about, I look at most. You know, I had a chat to someone recently. I said, "What's it like, being a prime minister? Would you ever get to take the job on?" And this person said, "No," and could have been. Why is that? Loneliest job there is. You can't trust anyone because you can't. Because half your teams are looking to topple you. How do you do it, Will?
Well, we broke the mould. We bucked that trend and provided stability, political stability, albeit in opposition for many years. A lot of bad polls, a lot of speculation, a lot of ribbing from our opposition, the then government, a lot of ridicule from people in the media and other commentators about how well we were going, but we just stood firm and said we would demonstrate stability. And that included after the 2010 election to which you refer.
Yeah.
We did get a swing. We won more of the popular vote than the Labor Party, but circumstances...
Well, come on, let's talk about that. Must have been heartbreaking, this story.
Well, yeah, it was tough because in 2010 we won more of the public support, more of the popular vote than the Labor Party. Then in government.
But wasn't there agreement, whoever did this?
They stated categorically, then Premier of the Labor Party, Labor government said, whoever wins the most votes should govern. So that was us, but they broke that promise. They also said they wouldn't do any deals with the Greens to form government. They did and appointed 2 Greens to cabinet to secure government. So... the governor decided to reinstate the Labor Green coalition, as it then was, to govern.
What was the logic behind that one?
Well, the governor thought that the incumbent government should have the right to continue to demonstrate in our parliament confidence and be allowed to continue to govern. And they could, because they then had the support of 2 Greens as cabinet ministers, sworn to cabinet solidarity and a coalition government. So it was a novel way. But from our point of view, though, and this goes to your earlier observation about trust and confidence in what politicians say, we said we would do no deals to form government, and we didn't. A lot of people were critical and said I should have gone off and tried to strike a deal with the Greens or the Labor Party or anyone to try and get into government, but we'd said we wouldn't, and we didn't. So I consigned myself to another 4 years as opposition leader, my colleagues and our party to another 4 years in opposition, which is a tough grind, even though we'd won the election. And our party stood by that decision. My colleagues stayed firm. We held the line, continued to rebuild, to build confidence, to get the right policies, people, and a positive plan and a vision for Tasmania to take to the 2014 election. And it's a much different result then.
Okay, well, let's just wind it back a little bit. You're going through day-to-day life in the opposition. You're trying to have that solidarity, as you're talking about, and clarity of message. But you get nailed in the papers, or you're getting nailed on TV, or dirty tactics left, right and centre. Just for all those out there who've got, starting their businesses or going to face the music sometime and, got to dust themselves off. How do you do it? You got to you got to go home, look at the mirror, you got to speak to the missus, the kids, your friends. Hard, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's character building.
That's a nice way to put it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's difficult. You've just, I think having the support of your team around you if you have one, if you're lucky enough to have one, because
that big telephone booth.
Yeah, and I think having firm and clear purpose in what you're doing and a belief.
So your resolve didn't falter?
No, I mean there were plenty of times we needed to recalibrate, and reassess, but locking yourself into a common purpose, it gives you, I think, the ability to be resilient and persistent, and that brings your team with you. So I think that's one of the key elements of leadership. But it's also important to, as best you can, it's almost impossible in a political setting to shut out the white noise or the clutter.
Yeah.
And to remain focused on what you're doing. I mean, in politics, it's a 24-hour cycle. Things move very quickly. So we had to become disciplined and not get distracted by whatever curveballs the opposition or the media or other commentators, disaffected Liberals, whoever it might be, were throwing at us. And it was challenging. But as I say, if you look at our record, we hold firm. We had no scandals, no leadership challenges, no, in-house issues or dramas that threw us off course. And I think by 2014, not only were we ready to govern, truly ready, Tasmanians had seen that we had demonstrated to them that we could.
Were you ready in
ourselves.
Were you ready in 2010?
Yeah, I believe so. But
you're super ready by 2014.
2014, we were primed, and we had taken the time, abandoning or putting aside those distractions to which I refer, gave us the time to build, an enormously substantial policy agenda, to prepare for government, to have a 100-day plan to hit the ground running, to have senior executive positions and cabinet positions mapped out as to what we were going to do. And a lot of this was very public. We communicated it with the voters, the people of Tasmania, so that they could see that we were serious. And I think that's essential for any opposition to do.
The night you lost, or a couple of days after when the governor makes the call, from a leadership perspective, that everyone's, you're a team, as you say, and normally you are toppled, that. Normally that's it. Or you've got to fall on your own sword. Okay, you decided not to. You probably made a few phone calls, I don't know. But what do you say to the team? You won it, but we lost it.
Yeah, and there was a few weeks over which this all played out. It's the electoral system in Tasmania is complicated with multi-member electorates. It takes a little while for the dust to settle. There was this sort of constitutional standoff. Both the Premier and I had to talk to the Governor to lay out how we saw things and how they may play out. There was a lot said that changed more from the Labor government than us, I have to say. But it gave us time to consider all our options, to commit to a course of action, and that was to hold true to our word. We all agreed, and I think this is another critical part of politics, as best you can, deliver on what you promise. And we had repeatedly, and I as leader, repeatedly made the promise that we wouldn't do any deals. We wouldn't govern in minority. We felt fundamentally the best thing for Tasmania was a majority Liberal government, even one that in the case of a tie, had one more of the public vote, would be able to govern. But we were denied that opportunity. But by then...
Am I going to call it a day? Did I say, look, I'm done, mate. I've just given my last 4 years to you?
No, I never did. And a lot of people were critical, said we should have done whatever it takes. You get a few shots at government. But so it was a big risk for us and for me personally to say, okay, let's sign up to another 4 years in opposition with no guarantee of success in 2014.
Nope.
But we did it. And, in reflection, it was the right call because it built a level of trust and confidence. By 2014, we could say to people, well, we're a unified, stable political organisation and you can believe what we say.
Okay. Now, meanwhile, during these years, we're watching what's play at federal government, topping and changing every 5 minutes. Rod Gillard Abbott, Turnbull, the merry-go-round. Were you watching that closely and were you learning from that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a lesson in how not to do it, because on both sides it discredited our democratic systems, confidence in it. You know, people in Singapore often ask me about Australia's political system and how wild it can be.
Yeah, right.
And point to those eras. And I think
sovereign risk in some regard, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And confidence in our democratic processes and questions, legitimate questions about the motivations for those leadership changes. And that was another case in point to me and my team, was that we didn't want to be like that. We wanted to demonstrate that we were quite a rare political phenomenon at that time. We were stable, we were determined, very patient, but also committed to our cause no matter what. And, you know, I think that's, you know, as I say, a very important reason behind why we were elected with such a resounding victory in 2014.
Hold it. Well, isn't the old theory, Will, I vote the government out, not the new one in? Although yours was resounding, right?
Yeah.
So has that theory fall on its ears or what?
I think there's a lot of logic in that.
They've had a decent run. They've been around for a while.
Yeah, and there's often a mood for change, etc. But I think people saw authenticity, commitment, and dedication to a mission that was a positive outlook for Tasmania that we so desperately needed. Because by the time the 4 years of this coalition government between Labor and the Greens had come to an end, Tasmania's unemployment rate was around 8%. The state was in recession. There were deficits, as I've said, in our budget for, you know, the foreseeable future. Record levels of population leaving. There were cuts to our schools and our hospitals. So, you know, there was a lot of cause for change. But it would have only happened, in my view, it could only have happened if we'd presented as a credible team to turn it round.
What did you change differently from 4 years earlier? Were you more public-facing? Were you better if you're messaging? Did you change anything differently?
Yeah, I was a lot more confident and assured. I think that election win, which turned out to be a loss, was quite informative and instrumental in terms of how, you know, we and I have realised that we needed to step it up, be very clinical, very deliberate, not leave anything to chance, and, you know, completely focus on our vision and our plan for Tasmania and use every opportunity to spell that out in a positive way. So it certainly, you know, reminded us that nothing's guaranteed. You know, it was a long-term commitment. It did require some patience, but also, you know, a belief in what we were doing. And by 2014, as I say, we were primed.
As Senator Richardson always said, Australians aren't mugs. So what do we want 9 times out of 10? I'm sure we don't change too much. There must be some basic stuff and fundamentals you just got to nail, don't you?
Yeah. I think getting the right people, the right policies, and a positive message are critical, and having authenticity and the confidence of more people than not are absolutely essential. And I think you've got to stand for something that you need to present a point of difference. You can't just be a mini-me version of the incumbent government. You have to not go out of your way to pick fights or find points of difference for the sake of it, but demonstrate what you would do differently and better, okay? Because without that, there's little reason to change.
Well, what did you want to stand for then?
We wanted to be a government that changed the mindset of Tasmanians, turned the economy around and made Tasmania a more attractive place to work, to invest in, that changed Tasmania from being the nicest national park or retirement village on the planet, which it was becoming.
Yep.
And accepting mediocrity when it came to education and health outcomes. And to do that, we needed to do things differently and be bolder. For too long, too much of Tasmania had been locked up. We weren't using our natural resources well. Half of the state is locked up in World Heritage or national parks, and that's magnificent because it drives our ecotourism and the visitor economy that come to enjoy that as much as Tasmanians do. But there are resources there that we're able to utilise. Some of those wilderness areas that we're able to open up to sensitive ecotourism and to more experiences for people to access, so it wasn't something for the elites only.
Yeah.
To open up more of our forest sector for production of what is the world's best timber products, and to utilise our renewable energy, which, you know, Tasmania has a unique advantage, being one of the few places in the world where we are 100% renewable, zero net emissions. Back in 2016 when I was Premier, we've achieved that decades in advance of what most nations want to achieve, and that's off the back of incredible natural resource competitive advantage, our hydro and wind resource. So let's use that. Let's export that into a very unstable national grid. Let's invest more into our renewable energy sector because it's a commodity that the world wants. So we needed to make more of that. So it was.
Did the price of the power come down?
Yeah, we reduced regulated cost of electricity in Tasmania to lowest levels, and you know there's still a lot more work that needs to be done in the national energy sector,
sure.
of course. So it remains an ongoing body of work. The new government now in Tasmania has well advanced plans to build a second cable across Bass Strait to secure Tasmania's energy supply, but also to allow for more export of energy into the national grid, because other states have suffered blackouts and terrible instability in their networks. So Tasmania's got a role there to play in the national grid to stabilise and to provide, you know, good, low cost, clean energy into the national market.
Did you keep all your promises, Will?
We certainly endeavoured to. I wouldn't.
What'd you say? Endeavoured.
Yeah. Well, I'd be lying if I said we did, because of course there are many things that we didn't and couldn't do as well as we would have liked. But we made it a fundamental commitment to keep every promise we could and to deliver as best we could. And we were accountable for it, and that's another important thing we did. Not only would we articulate our plan and all the key metrics and key performance indicators, but we increased transparency and accountability across government so our record of achievement could be tracked. But yeah, look, there are times where things don't go as well as you would have liked or would have planned. There's work still underway now that our government commenced. We had a global pandemic, for instance, that interrupted a lot of what we were doing. There's always reasons why things don't go as smoothly as you'd like or as much to plan as you'd hoped, but we were always determined. It was another critical element of the values, the foundations which we put underneath our government, was to deliver on what we promised. So we bent over backwards at every one of them.
So what do you feel were the classic question, the key achievements under your watch? Well,
turning the economy round was no mean feat, and we were the butt of jokes.
Yeah.
The mendicant state, we turned it into the best, fastest growing state in the country for the first time ever.
In a few minutes ago, you said the mindset of the people. What was the mindset of the people before you came in to power?
Well, very negative. We were in recession, more Tasmanians leaving. There were more reasons to go than stay. Education outputs and results inadequate. Health services inadequate. There was a sense of negativity and despair around a lot of what was happening in Tasmania. So we wanted to
a bit like the UK before Tony Blair turned up.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it's not an easy thing to turn around, but there were symbolic things we did early in getting into government. We had this old Myers building, Myers shopping centre in the middle of Hobart that had burnt down tragically, and it had been an undeveloped block in the middle of in the heart of Hobart CBD.
Yeah, right.
I rang the CEO very early in my time as Premier and said, what can we do to get that up out of the ground and rebuild it. So as a government, you look at tax concessions, incentives to support employment and investment, ways to reduce green and red tape that prevent progress and planning. And it was restored and rebuilt. Tasmania's...
So the department still got rebuilt, did it?
Yeah, and it was symbolic of breathing life back into Hobart's CBD.
And we can get things done.
Yeah, we were going to lose the Qantas call centre, which had been based in Tasmania, and we're under threat from other states who wanted it off us. It was a big deal, several hundred employees.
Yep.
I got hold of Alan Joyce's phone number somehow. I rang him direct and said, what do we need to do to keep this in the state? And government, it may not be the ideal Liberal way, but we recognised pragmatically that it was very symbolic to turn around people's mindsets and to show that we would fight for Tasmanian jobs and for keeping that sort of operation in Tasmania, and it's still there. Mona, this magnificent museum that opened in Tasmania, very controversial. Yeah. They certainly pushed the limits. An incoming Liberal/Conservative government, we increased support for the festivals and events that are attached to Mona, which were driving a sense of optimism and ambition, creativity, and a sense of, I suppose, ambition for Tasmania to be the best in the world. This was capturing the imagination and the attention of people right across the world. So we backed them. And again, people were less supportive of that. They're very controversial. They do a lot of things that can offend members of the public, but we backed it because it was giving Tasmania a real cutting edge point of difference and demonstrating that Tasmania was a very cool place to be as well. So making some selective decisions to back winners and to show that we were a government that would back enterprise, innovation, creativity and confidence.
Decision-making processes. I sort of live in a bit of doubt with some of what I see these days where you've been voted in, you've been elected, you've got to make some decisions. But I get the impression every time a real tough decision is made in this country, pollies don't have the courage to stand up for what they talk about. So they then run it past everybody, i.e. go and get a poll on it. Is this the right decision? Should we dilute it? And then I read in the newspaper, does it pass the pub test? I mean, it's pretty basic stuff that we've got to go to that level to get some real stuff done. So how did you go about it? Were you one of those, or you a man of conviction, or what was the decision-making process?
Yeah.
It's disappointing sometimes what you see here.
I get that. I was always very mindful, and as I said earlier, that politics is about the art of the possible. So don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. I think progress is something to be encouraged and to be seized. It may not always be ideal. So we were unashamedly pragmatic. We were open to compromise. It's not as I say, not a dirty word, or shouldn't be, because I think that progress and steps forward are to be encouraged rather than nothing. But you do need to bring the public with you, so you have to get a sense of how they feel. You'll never get anywhere if you are dogmatic, because you'll alienate a large percentage of the public. If you look at The Voice, what had bipartisan support in some shape and a lot of goodwill across the country, I think that was lost because of an unwillingness by the current Labor government to listen to other perspectives, to perhaps look at ways to bring on board the Liberal Party, if not the coalition, and to enlist their support. I don't think enough effort was made there to harness that at the earlier stages, and it was lost. So I think that's a good example of where if you don't make those efforts to compromise and to bring others with you, including your political opponents, on something as important as that, it's destined to fail.
Much difference between Liberal and Labor?
Yeah, I do believe fundamentally there is. There's a different mindset.
Today, you think there is?
Oh, nationally, or do you mean? Or
Yeah, I ought to say nationally.
certainly in my experience in Tasmania, there's a different mindset. It's a little cliche, but the Liberals, in my experience, very much more open to enterprise, smaller government, backing business to drive the state. Often you'd need to invest in it,
Yep.
but that's where the Labor Party would often stop us in our tracks, and we're less inclined to do so. So I think, the ideological wars are really for the extremes, and there are clear differences. But I think,
If you think about what you just said, what about reform, right? So if you look back, I'll go federal government for a bit now. So Liberals are terrific, always telling us how they're going to balance the books, check the budget and everything else. And the Labor are great for spending every cent that they've got. But at least it's interesting to see where reform comes from. You look at the Hawke and the Keatings. That was Labor.
Yep.
Now, I think they've lost a little bit at the moment, how they're engaging and where they're going. Do you think the Libs bring enough reform? There's been no tax policy reform. I don't think under the last the recent period of time under the Liberal and the federal government, I think business almost had the door shut to them. If you're talking about Liberal beliefs and views and what it stands for, I don't know. What are your thoughts in general about reform, engaging with business and taking the country forward in that manner?
Yeah. Hawke and Keating were exceptional, without doubt, on the economic front, backed in large part by the coalition opposition. John Howard was key to that.
Yep.
And took that into government. And he and Costello also exceptional reformers, bringing in extraordinarily unpopular tax, but also implementing fiscal reform, which reduced an enormous, I think, $96 billion debt back in the day. It was an enormous demonstration of fiscal responsibility and management. I think since then the record's perhaps less impressive, and I look, to attempts past. John Hewson had an enormously substantial economic blueprint. That was one where he couldn't bring people with him, and it's a good example.
Couldn't sell the message.
That's right.
Yeah, and he also had one of the best against him at the time too.
Yeah, that's right. And it's you've got to look at the circumstance of the time. There are different reasons why it's less. And I wouldn't say for a minute it would be easy for Hawke and Keating or for Howard and Costello. By any stretch, it wasn't. But, their track records are one where you can point to significant.
Okay. So
and industrial relations was another area where Howard seriously stuck his neck out.
But where's it been since?
Yeah.
Where's this country going since? We're talking a decade plus now that it's almost been, I'm not saying rudderless, but you speak to most business people, it's just get on with it, and it's just white noise. These guys can't make a decision, soundbite non-stop. Country seems to be coming second. Political bias is coming first, or shots at each other all day long. I don't know. I think, and the average Australian, or the younger Australian in particular, the frightening thing is they're turned off completely.
Yeah, and I think in defence of our Commonwealth, it's the Federation that can often do us a disservice. State premiers like myself, and that very, very fierce competition between states, territories, and the Commonwealth can, derail and make it very difficult for an incumbent national government to, progress its reforms. If you look at hostile states ganging up on a Commonwealth government, it can be very counterproductive to the national interest. That's unquestionable, and we've seen that in recent years, including through the pandemic, where before long things did run off the rails. Now I was watching this from abroad, but it didn't look great.
Yeah, okay.
And what I was hearing from here didn't look great either. So what was very well intentioned and quite appropriate response to a global but national crisis and managing a pandemic and an economic shutdown and recession in our nation, and bringing the states and territories and the Commonwealth together went well for a while, but even then couldn't endure.
Or did it? Were you proud of what you saw, how Australians were treating each other? We couldn't even get planes organised to go and pick up Australians sitting in different parts of the world.
I was in Singapore.
No, I think it was absolutely disgraceful.
I was in Singapore. We were trying to get a Singapore airline to fly Australians, repatriate Australians, not just from Singapore, but from across the world through that global hub. And it was a very difficult challenge. And it was even then being contemplated, certainly by the Singaporeans, whether or not they could strike deals with states unilaterally and bypass our national government or states who were disinclined to reopen their borders. And they couldn't understand why that might not be possible. And obviously the political leadership and their bureaucrats could, but a lot of people could not understand why it was not possible, for instance, for Singapore's airlines to fly into New South Wales or into Western Australia or Tasmania or wherever it may have been. Yeah. But that was the nature of our federation, that those things, were not possible. And there's good reason for that. We are a nation, but we're a nation of, effectively sovereign states as well. So it does complicate the political landscape. And I think this goes some way to explaining why our national leadership can face additional challenges to a more aggressive or ambitious reform agenda, because they've also got states across the country who are often predispossessed against that political imperative.
You're listening to No Limitations with special guest, the Honourable Will Hodgman. In our next episode, I sit down with Nyungai Warren Mundine, Director, Indigenous Forum at the Centre for Independent Studies. Be sure to join us on our next episode. And now, back to the show. So do we need three levels of government?
In an ideal world, if you could have a system like Singapore, I think that it would...
Even the UK, they don't have three.
But this is an island that's the size... Singapore is the size of, Greater Hobart.
Yeah.
It's a place,
But do we need three? What do you reckon?
Ideally not. Ideally, we don't. I think overgoverned, inefficiencies, duplication. I think,
like 27 million people?
Yeah, and, in Tasmania, I can't remember how many, 29 odd councils, 3 levels of government for a population of 570,000. But it's, very politically challenging to change that.
Well, no, I don't see Johnny Polly's voting himself out of a job.
Yeah, well, it's a fraud area, but if you want to get serious reform and have the courage to do it, but this is an area where, people would rather as politicians be focused on cost of living, healthcare, education, etc., not on ourselves. So a lot of that reform of the federation work, which Tony Abbott commenced when I was Premier, and there was a lot good about that. When I was Premier, Malcolm Turnbull spoke about reforming our taxation arrangements so that states could increase their income-generating abilities, income tax, for instance, take a share of that. Now, there's a lot of political downside to any government wanting to take on their own taxation powers, but that was all about reducing the reliance on states, or perhaps expecting them to do more to stand up and generate their own income, to the point you made in your opening question. So it was a good discussion to have. I think a good debate to have, but that got shot down within 24 hours by, Labor premiers, frankly. And I know the same can and will happen in reverse, where you lose that unanimity across the nation and that common sense, rational approach to policy making.
What's leadership then, Will? You've been one as a Premier. You've seen leaders in federal government, so you've lived overseas. You've seen the Singaporeans, you've watched Tony Blair. So what is leadership then?
In a political context, I think it's about demonstrating and leading by example. And that's why I did keep my word when tested and committed myself to another 4 years and my team in opposition. It's why we, and I include my colleagues, because leadership is all about empowering your team and enlisting the support of others to build that coalition of support, and to be firm in your resolve and to deliver what you've promised as best you can. No one ever expects you to keep all your promises, not just cynically. Most people, sensible people, realise that it's impossible to do that. But if you can demonstrate that you've done your very best, that you're committed, and that there are good reasons why not, I think people, if not forgiving, they're certainly understanding of that. And I think a preparedness to be honest about that is an important element of leadership as well. Because looking back, perhaps too often in my career, I would have fudged things and denied that perhaps we hadn't delivered what we'd promised, or I would have been more conscious of messaging that spun a different version of reality. And people see through that, and I knew it whenever I did it. And so I tried to eliminate that as best as possible, because it's a flawed political strategy, but also, it's not realistic to be perfect, and expecting our political leadership to do everything perfectly, to not change their minds occasionally, to not admit when they've made mistakes, is something that, again, I think looking at my experience in Singapore versus Australia, if it happens in Australia, it's a pile-on. And hypercritical, hyperventilation, hysterical reactions, overreactions to people making a mistake, changing their mind, canvassing an idea that's politically risky, can be career-ending. So that's why I think we can be risk-averse here as politicians in Australia as well.
If you look back and said, well, if I had the time again, what could I have done better? What did I miss out? What would you suggest?
As a politician?
As a Premier?
Yeah, I think...
Health's the big one, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of unfinished business. I mean, I'm very, proud and content with the achievements and the progress we made in the time I was there. But, there's a lot of work to be done in Tasmania. And, I'm really pleased that we were able to demonstrate that we could turn Tasmania's economy around. We could change the educational prospects of so many Tasmanians. Just this week, with my former deputy, now Premier in Tasmania, I found that a really important reform that we'd undertaken against some pretty intense opposition from unions, especially, and others, from the other side of the political fence, to extend Tasmania's schools to provide years 11 and 12. Back when we came into government, a lot of Tasmania's high schools finished at year 10, the only state in the country where that occurred, inexplicably, because it meant thousands of school kids felt their schooling finished at year 10 and departed education or any formal training from then on. So they were falling through the cracks, mainly in regional centres around our very decentralised state. So
here we are going around the world as one of the sort of leading lights in the G20, telling everybody when you go to Africa, the biggest thing you've got to invest in is education. And our own backyard, we're not even encouraging them past year 10.
Yeah, absolutely. Not providing the facilities, the amenities, the ability for them to access a school in their community without needing to get on a bus and travel for hours at either end of the day, not providing in their home community a line of sight to what they could do and what they could be. And just this week, in returning, so we committed to fix that and turn 58 schools in Tasmania into ones that provided years 11 and 12, like most kids need these days to go off and get gainful employment and to increase their prospects. So we did that. There was a lot of opposition from unions, from the school college community, but we resisted that. 7,500 kids at least, since we brought that in, have completed their years 11 and 12. When we came in under 50% in those communities, under 50% of school kids were achieving their TCE, their years 11 and 12. Yep. Now it's more like 2/3. So I think that, in terms of looking back on the positive things we've done was perhaps one of the most impactful, because there's no better investment than in a kid's education, and we were able to not only extend that at the later years of formal teaching or education in Tasmania, but also getting them into school environments, learning environments earlier as well, because Tasmanian kids were getting into school later than their interstate counterparts as well. So Tasmanian kids were spending less time in learning environments than kids on mainland schools. So that's something I look back on, very positively, and that's something we certainly did deliver.
Okay, and what didn't you deliver? Typical politician, you always spin it. Come on, what didn't you deliver?
Oh, look, as I say, there's work still underway. A lot of major infrastructure projects take a little longer than you'd like. Mm-hmm. And Tasmania's road network needing a lot of investment, often co-partnered with the Commonwealth Government. We're building major bridges, or a major bridge across the Doohan in Hobart. So large infrastructure projects, still work in progress.
Yep. So what, over budget over time now?
Yeah, they do typically tend to go that way. But there's.
But is that acceptable too, Will? I get, you listen to the pollies get up and say, we're just signing off today, $100 million, $100 billion, whatever the thing is going to be. They never tell me how much they're going to save. They're really proud and tell me how much they're going to spend on my hard-earned tax, but I never hear much. Oh, well, why do you got to spend $100 billion when when picks up the phone, rings up a couple of construction houses, etc. They could come in at a lot less than that, but very proud to spend the dough. And we come in late and we come in over budget, pretty large percent.
Well, one of our signature policies on coming into government was to reduce the cost of the public sector, and we did that, and that was politically challenging, but much.
Well, it means you've got to create other jobs, eh?
What's that?
It means you've got to create other jobs.
Yeah, absolutely, and be more efficient with taxpayers' money.
Yep.
So we set ourselves that challenge. We delivered that against some fairly robust opposition, of course, from unions and other stakeholders, but it was necessary, and it helped get our budget back into surplus, and that produces greater economic and fiscal flexibility to do more.
Yep.
So I think there'll always be reasons why projects blow out, and we've had a global pandemic, we've had supply chain issues, we've had there are labour force issues. Australia, it's a very expensive place to build things. Now you look at Singapore, again, a magnificent example of how their planning system's more effective, their construction industry is very effective and phenomenal in its rate of completion. There are health and safety issues, it being an Asian country where they look to improvement and look to Australia. But Australia is generally regarded and known to be a very expensive place to build. And that includes for government.
The other thing too is, you've been in Singapore. A lot of companies come knocking on their door, and when they sit down and meet the parliamentarians, deals are done, incentives are given, tax rates are incredibly interesting and worthwhile. Okay, therefore I might hire Singaporeans. Gee whiz, that's a smart idea. Do we have anywhere near enough thinking in that regard? I mean, we're at the bottom end of the world. We're losing industry. We're not necessarily gaining a lot for all the stuff we talk about. So what do you think? And from your experience as a Premier, how much are you allowed to move the numbers, etc., and incentivise, big technology giants to come in and do stuff in Tasmania or something in that regard?
Yeah, and this is one way where the Federation can, work positively, because it does allow states to compete. And the Qantas call centre example I gave, where I think we were up against Queensland and possibly Victoria, was one where we had to demonstrate that we were willing to reduce payroll tax, to provide incentives to support fit out, or to accommodate the operation continuing in Tasmania. That comes at a cost, but the offset, of course, is more people employed, growth in that sector which occurred. So an economic advantage.
Benefit.
Yeah.
Yep.
But I don't think so. Having the states compete against each other can be a good thing.
But what about not just the states, but the international opportunities.
Yeah,
You're saying
and
you're
that-
sitting in Singapore and you're saying, there are 6 different lots of whatever it is coming out of Australia knocking on corporates around the world. They don't understand where Tasmania is or Queensland is or WA. There's one joint called Australia.
Yeah.
Half the time it's Austria. So there's Australia, right? Are we really smart how we're going about this?
No, and that's where I think, nationally we could do with, a more effective, tailored approach. And we've done that in recent times, in my time, to attract high-quality business immigration into Australia, investment into Australia to support an inflow of capital, very targeted and very sector-specific. Not as well as Singapore does, and it's where they excel. They will not only manage their population and population growth very carefully, and they have to because it's a tiny country that's very space constrained, but they will look deliberately at sectors where they need the support of outsiders, and that includes Australians where, there could be 15 to 30,000 on a good day when, it was prior to COVID, Australians living and working in Singapore. But the Singaporean government would say to me, we'll only let in foreigners, Australians, Brits, Americans, if they are delivering benefit to our country unashamedly.
Yep.
And many have benefited from a very favourable tax arrangement, a high quality of life, very safe community in which they live. A lot have come from professional services, law, accounting. We now need tech, digital, green economy jobs. We need to protect the sovereignty and security of our nation because we've been tested by COVID and also geopolitical tensions and threats. So if you can bring those things to us, Australia, your people are welcome. They will shift and pivot, as we say, to areas that provide a direct national benefit. And it's not to serve the needs of Australian expats, it's to serve the needs of Singaporean citizens. And I think that's where Australia can do better. And I think we're getting better at it. But again, the Federation and a slightly complex tapestry and changing political environment across states and territories, as well as a very quick turnaround in the national arena, doesn't help give that sort of sense of consistency.
So we don't have a 5-year plan,
Policy
10-year plan,
exactly.
20-year plan coming out from feds. Is there absolute sort of like a minister for business, i.e. just to focus on that?
I think having a clear and articulated plan is central to Singapore's success. Very transparent, and they've got as I say, a far more compliant, dare I say it, or
yeah, sure.
Trusting community than we do in Australia.
Yep.
And that's not always a good thing.
Yeah, I agree.
Robust democracies, often a lot more, or can be a lot more productive and helpful. But we lack that, and in Australia, and I think also tendency to catastrophize public policy considerations, discussions, debates can derail goodwill in these areas.
Yeah, but Will, if you were going to stand back, okay, put your Australian cap on, not your Premier cap on. All right, we've got productivity issues second to none. Arguable on the east coast of Australia, per capita, we're in recession. That's arguable. All right, so we're doing the same old we've done for years, relying on the mining fraternity, okay, which dig big holes and export it to get it processed. So we're losing a manufacturing sector on the east coast, and on the mining side, they don't process. So we're not that smart as a country. But let's just roll it forward 5-10 years or so. And if the commodity prices don't go up, China buying up and being smart about Africa, processing, they're years ahead in their processing, and certain rare earths and certain critical minerals, as the Americans have found out and addressing swiftly. We're great at making coffees. I don't know how many we need, but where are we going to be, Will, if we don't start getting this sorted? Because everyone coming down seems to stop into Singapore. They open their arms and say, well, how about we sit here and do a deal which favours you for the long term and favours us for the long term? But we don't seem to be anywhere near the deal-making capability.
Yeah, well, we can be more of that because we have so much that the rest of the world
I
wants.
hear it all day long, but where's the demonstration of, well, who's turning up here really signing up big?
Yeah, and that's our challenge. We need to, and from my Singapore experience, I know there's a lot of interest, and increasingly so, in Australia's services and products, and there's a high level of trust in what we offer. The issues we have is less so with Southeast Asia, but a tyranny of distance that we need to help overcome. Supply chain issues which were disrupted, of course, through COVID, but there's a sovereignty issue there and a security issue that we need to address. So that's through, those transport networks, improve those, and our connection to our key markets, particularly in Southeast Asia, and reducing cost and inefficiencies in getting approvals, support for projects or investments here in Australia is an area of work, as is reciprocating of our investment into Asia, which is important not only for our economic opportunity but also to strengthen those connections between our nations. And that's where the recent work done by Nicholas Moore, who headed up the task force into the Southeast Asia strategy, has demonstrated we really, really need to lift our game, because whether it's complacency or an inability to seize and appreciate that opportunity, we've sort of flatlined when it comes to that reciprocal connection into what is the world's fastest growing economic region and will be for some time.
Well, the world's population, 70% is in Asia.
Yeah.
And growing.
And very close to us geographically. So there's a lot.
So tax incentive wise, what's the rule? How far can you go when as Premier? Can you go down to, what's the lowest you can get to? Is there a limit? If a big, let's say a magnificent technology comes out and we want to come and use you, you're the smart country down there, what can you do for us? And I knock on your door, Premier of Tasmania, thanks. I've seen all, the hydro, I've seen the water and seen the great forests and, beautiful countryside. But hey, I'm here to do business. What can you do for me?
Yeah, there are limits. There are limits on your fiscal capacity to provide support.
Well, what could the Singaporeans get down to?
They're very effective at attracting investment. They've got a lot of competitive advantage, really. They're the only country in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN, or they're the best placed for investment. They're the most secure, stable, politically, economically. They're a good investment. So they are a standalone, really, in ASEAN. There are fast developing nations nearby, but now
I thought we're supposed to be the art of the possible, aren't we?
Yeah, Hong Kong's now obviously less appealing. So Singapore really, has a captive audience.
India's starting to go like Billy at the moment, sir.
Yeah, but Singapore will fiercely protect its reputation and its credibility to be that place. So, I don't say it's all easy, but they have enormous fiscal reserves. They are a very self-sufficient nation that is, in fact, the largest investor in China of any nation on the globe.
Yep.
Nation of 5 million people. That demonstrates the financial weight that they can throw around. So what we need to do is get a lot more of that focus, and it will often also harness interest and opportunity from other Southeast Asian nations. The growth that we're seeing in Vietnam or in Indonesia, the opportunities there, Malaysia, wherever. There's enormous opportunity in ASEAN more broadly, and I think that's where we can do a lot better to facilitate that, and that's clearly a focus of the government now, and no doubt will be ongoing.
What was President Xi like to meet?
He was impressive, imposing, pleasant. He and his wife, Madame Pang, who visited Tasmania for a day. It was a rare experience because the pressure on us as a state, a small state, to ensure it was a safe, seamless exercise was impressed on me from the highest levels, from both our government and also China's. So there was a lot of pressure to get it right, and we were able to host the president in Hobart and Madampang for a day. I think 2/3 or 3/4 of our police service were on duty to make sure it ran smoothly. So we were a little worried if anything happened that day that could pose a threat to public safety. We were going to be a little distracted, but we pulled it off exceptionally well. Very positive coverage for Tasmania. It catapulted our reputation because so many millions of Chinese watching Xi's every move suddenly saw Tasmania as this incredible place that they wanted to visit, to come and see our devils and our lavender and all the rest. It was, it was quite a pivotal moment in Tasmania's economic turnaround, and it helped kickstart this recovery that I've spoken about.
So what have you learned about China then from your experience both as the Premier of Tasmania but also in your last or recent role in Singapore?
Yeah, a lot's happened since. I mean, this is a time, as I say, when our nations were at their closest, perhaps, as close as they'd been before. We signed a free trade agreement. There were Antarctic arrangements that were being struck. States and territories were collectively going to China to promote our produce, seafood, wines, agricultural products, tourism, international education. It was an enormous period of growth as economically, culturally and diplomatically. I think we're always aware you don't put all your eggs in one basket, so we needed to be mindful of markets elsewhere and the risks of things turning as they have done. But I think for Australia, our economic prospects are best served by stronger trade relations with China, and that will also enhance, I would hope, and expect better peace, stability and security across our globe. I'm a firm believer in that meaningful trade and investment exchange and people-to-people connections will help deliver a more stable and secure global environment. So I'm pleased that we've been able to return to a smoother pathway forward. But it also, what's happened in recent years, demonstrates that we need to build our sovereignty and our capability in Australia as well, and cannot be as reliant on international markets because a global pandemic or geopolitical downturn will very quickly destabilise our international context and to the disadvantage of a country which is, as you say, at the bottom of the world, very geographically separated and potentially exposed.
What about integrity? We turn a blind eye to certain things?
Well, we shouldn't ever do that.
But we do. If we're going to, it's a trade-off, I assume, is it?
Of what?
Well, there's certain members of communities who are under difficult circumstances in that country.
In China, yeah. Sorry.
I'm sure, like in other countries, right? So I guess that's the
the
difficult one, isn't it?
We shouldn't, and I know from my experience working in our foreign affairs agency that we are resolute in holding firm to Australia's values. In Singapore, it was expected and required of me as head of mission to communicate our displeasure and our disagreement with Singapore utilising the death penalty and capital punishment.
Yeah.
And whenever there was an execution in Singapore, we would express that as a standard course of action. And similarly with China, or any other nation which we disagree, we have to, be upfront about that. It doesn't mean, though, that we can't look to strengthen trade, investment connections. Exactly.
Yeah, okay. How long were you Premier for?
6 years, just on 6 years.
So why'd you call it a day? Was there something? Did you ever sit back that night before you did call it and think, well, the swing just to win was 9%, which was unbelievable. It was majority government, which was first time we were 87, or for Liberals, 87 years. And I'm at the peak of my powers, potentially. I could have a tremendous legacy here. Walk down the street the rest of my life or everywhere else. Why'd you depart?
Well, 6 years is a fair stretch in that job. I'm the 7th longest serving Tasmanian Premier out of, close to 50. So that gives you a sense of how long we last. I'd had, by the end, around 18 years in Parliament. So perhaps if I'd had less in opposition, I might have had a little more in the tank to go a little longer. But
you're only 50, weren't
you? Yeah, bang on. But I think, I always felt if ever I'm questioning whether I can give 100% every day of the year, which is expected and rightly so, if I ever question that, then I need to think carefully about if I should still be doing this job. So in the summer of 2020, when I did start to question that, I made a call where I could have, perhaps pressed ahead and gone on for sure. I love the job. There's a lot I was giving up, but I always felt I needed to be totally and utterly committed to it. Maybe over Christmas break's not the best time to be contemplating that, but once I did, and thinking what would best serve an incoming Premier and administration to continue our work when Parliament's not sitting, when there's less disruption to the business of government over that summer, I made what was a really, really tough call. There are family considerations. It does take a lot of your time and you away from them, but I had their full support either way. And as I say, I love the job, and it's not an easy thing to give up. I'd like to think, though, that we're judged on what we do in the time we're there, not how long we're there.
Get a phone call at all from federal members to say, come and join us? You've done a great job. You're only 50. You've still got plenty of energy. You enjoy politics. The family's giving you the green light if you want to stay in politics. Maybe come over and join us in the federal scene.
Yeah, I move in circles where those discussions are not uncommon. I'm really relishing, though, the role out of government. I did, as I say, 18...
Did you get the call?
18 years. I would have brushed it off.
Would you?
And come
on.
It's one of those things where inevitably people have asked at various stages, including before I entered state parliament, would I run federally? But yep. I thought state's a good fit for me. I'm proud, passionate Tasmanian. I love the fact that I can be 5 hours drive from home wherever I am and not flying back and forth to Canberra, which my dad had done for a number of years, and just places a whole another layer of difficulty on a job, which I admire anyone who does it. Getting from Tassie to Canberra is not easy, let alone from Western Australia. So it fit our circumstances well, and I love Tasmania, very passionate about it. I was able to play a role in a national context. I think bringing premiers and the Commonwealth together regularly is a good thing. I was thrilled to get an opportunity to work in the global network for the Australian government and work overseas. So that, rounded out close to 20 years in government. I'm now trying to deinstitutionalise and get into the real world and working, in the non-government sector, which, at my age and needing to earn an honest living is proving challenging, stimulating and refreshing.
So what are you doing?
You might think somewhat unimaginatively have established a consultancy business. So I know what it's like to run a small business now and to set that up, and it's no easy feat, and needing to reinvent myself as well and to provide service to businesses. My first targets being those that have interests in Southeast Asia, notably Singapore and Australia, and I'm providing consultancy, corporate advice for a couple of great businesses or a few that are in that space, because I'm still really committed to doing all I can to strengthen the bonds between Australia and Singapore. I love that place deeply as well now too. So I'm doing that, working for our University of Tasmania as well. I'm now an adjunct professor. So just to add another title, and what that means is, no, I'm not.
You're giving lectures at all,
not
or not?
Lecturing anyone, and I'm not there to teach or have an academic role. It's really about supporting their efforts to engage internationally and domestically across Australia, to attract students, to work with our alumni. There's 1,000 UTAS graduates, alumni in Singapore, for instance.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Enormous connection that our university and all Australian universities really have, or most, certainly with Singapore, a couple of 100,000 who came to learn in Australia. It's one of the things that really keeps Australia and Singapore's connection so close, because these Singaporeans have fond memories of coming out to universities right across Australia, and it's a great soft power asset I found in diplomacy that we should employ a lot more. But University of Tasmania now has my focus. I'm doing a bit of work for them, and just working in areas too that I'm passionate about. So a couple of the businesses that I've referred to are working in technology, sustainability, supporting innovation, which lends itself beautifully to what Australia and Singapore are endeavouring to do more of in digital economy, green economy, defence security, which are important to our national interests, and as well as cultural connections between our education systems.
So how's your old government team doing?
Well, they are about to go to an election in just a couple of days, so we'll see. But my deputy of 14 years is Premier, and they've done a great job. Really difficult circumstances. Just by chance, I left prior to COVID engulfing the world and Tasmania with it. I had my own experience of that on a small island in Southeast Asia in Singapore. So it was a tough time for everyone, and it's had a real impact on Tasmania's economy and fiscal position, because governments across the world had to do a lot to keep economies ticking over and people employed. So there's a lot of challenge ahead of governments across the world, and Tasmania has its share. So, but they're managing a state, its economy, growth, investment, unemployment rate down, 50,000 more Tasmanians employed than when we came into government's a lot for our small state. Population growth for a long while, that was on the decline. So, the place is still going very well.
Okay. Earlier on, you mentioned The Voice. Now, during your time as Premier, did you look to change the Constitution?
Yeah.
You want to talk us through what was going on there, and what was the sort of the reasoning behind that?
Yeah, so one of those portfolios I took on as Premier was Aboriginal Affairs, because I believe that, like every other state and territory, and all very different in context, we need to do a lot more to close the gap and to reconcile with Australian Aboriginals. And in Tasmania, there were a few things that really stood out. One thing about a massive policy challenge about Aboriginality and who is considered Aboriginal in Tasmania.
Can't I identify one now?
Well, and this was part of the problem in Tasmania. We had a system
that wrought, isn't it?
Well, it conflicted with the Australian government's system or framework as well, and that was leading to inconsistencies. We needed to address that and to reconcile how Aboriginality could be determined, because as well in Tasmania there were Aboriginal Tasmanians who were being excluded from eligibility to Tasmanian government programs.
So how did you reconcile it?
Where they could access federal government policies.
But couldn't get Tasmanian?
Yeah. And you'd have members of the same family not receiving the same support and services. So we had to reconcile that, and that caused enormous friction within certain sections of our Aboriginal community and leadership that had played a dominant role in answering that question. And as difficult as it is for white guys in Australian governments to step into this space, we felt there was a moral imperative to do that. So that was an enormously challenging body of work. And former governments had conceded that the system was broken but hadn't had the political courage to deal with it. We thought there was a window of opportunity to do that, and we did. The constitution change was more symbolic. We were the only state, I think perhaps Western Australia also, but the only state that didn't recognise or acknowledge the fact that there were First Nations peoples before us and our government. So it was an appropriate recognition to include in our Constitution's preamble a reflection of that, not dissimilar to the things that had been thought through at a national level, and something with which I think most Australians would agree or not be offended by. It brought no benefit or advantage to Aboriginal Tasmanians other than an acknowledgement by their government that they have a connection to our island that predates any parliament and any government. So we did that. It was something that received not only bipartisan support, but was in fact co-sponsored by Labor members, Greens Party members, and there was a unanimous support for this to occur. We had to be very careful with the language. We had to ensure, obviously, that the indigenous communities across Tasmania, which are various, were included in consultations. It did take a lot of time and careful consideration, but I think a key to that was getting that bipartisan support. It's a different thing in changing Tasmania's Constitution Act. It's a legislative statutory provision that can be done by Parliament, literally, with the stroke of a pen, you might say. Not like changing our national constitution through referendum, which is a lot more challenging. But I think that principle of getting bipartisan support before you commence, or at least at a very early stage, is a key to gathering national or broader community support. And it would be, while I was supportive of the voice and the concept, I had serious questions and some misgivings about legalities, processes, how it might work. I was always of the mind that we're better to try than not. But once it lost any prospect of bipartisan support, which it had, and a lot of goodwill, extending back to a number of previous Liberal governments, it was doomed to fail, and sadly that was proven to be the case.
Wasn't a lot of documentation for it either, was there? So I don't know how one can make decisions.
Yeah, I think you've got
documentation.
You've got to be able to answer all questions, do so willingly and dispassionately, but with power, influence, and persuasion, and authority, bring people with you. And I think for something like that, it really required more effort to secure bipartisan support. The same can be said of the Republic debate, which I've been involved with, or other, very nationally significant decisions.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting watching the Voice, sort of the discussion. It became very polarising as opposed to stop attacking me. Can we just focus on the subject matter and work through it, as opposed to throwing names at each other? And that seems to got lost along the way. Yeah,
and supporters and opponents on either side can harness that ill feeling if it suits a political advantage, but it's short-sighted and it derailed a debate of national significance, which a lot of people care about and many would be interested in. And it sends an interesting message, I guess, to all of us. And anyone else who's watching about how capable we are of moving things like that forward. I mean, I'm equally as passionate about Australia becoming a republic. This is one thing my old man and I used to war over. He was a staunch constitutional monarchist.
Yeah, okay.
I was at one stage a deputy convener of the Australian Republican movement back in the time when Malcolm Turnbull was the national leader. And I firmly believe in Australia having an Australian as its head of state and a sovereign leadership that's not based on hereditary entitlement, but that was derailed similarly because it was just impossible to bring together at least a core of bipartisan support. So they're big lessons in our national progress, and you don't
think this government's going to have no appetite to bring that up now.
It'd be very, and look, frankly, as passionate as I am about that issue, I think the time and effort that was invested into the voice debate, which is really, really important, has for many people come at the expense of other more pressing political concerns, cost of living issues, job security, energy issue, etc. There's a lot. And that's a pity because we should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, and we can. And I would never argue against a government, especially an incoming one that had a mandate to do such a thing, to give it its all. And it's not to say that they weren't focused on all those other things, but it certainly took a lot of the national attention.
So as a political observer now, how do you see the performance of the Australian federal government?
Solid, if not brilliant. I think to my earlier point, or to my previous point, there's a lot more that it needs to do to address serious political concerns.
So you think we're doing okay on energy?
Oh, well, no. I come from a state that's well advantaged and by no means has it easily, but I think Tasmania in many respects is a leader, but we're an island separate from a nation which has enormous energy challenges across it. So, but no, by no means are we getting it right on that front.
Immigration policy?
No, I think that is unclear. It doesn't serve our national interest. And to earlier discussions about getting the right people that we need to build our nation, and that's not to say that our immigration policies are bringing in the wrong type of people, but I think we can do better to manage not only population intake, source and destination, but also where immigrants are located and reside. Because in Tasmania, for instance, where we've had population decline or relatively modest growth, we need more people in our state. So we would often, in the national context, look to ways to support population growth in Tasmania, whereas it can be in larger states very compacted and concentrated into certain areas, and that causes other social demographic issues that governments need to manage as well. I think we, as much as we can, and again, Singapore's a tiny island and they have levers at their disposal to better manage their migration policy settings. It's a lot more complicated in Australia, but I think we do need to sharpen or tighten up migration policy, and that's by no means to say I don't believe in a growing Australia, but one that serves our national interest.
All right. Trade? How are we doing in trade?
Good, yeah, and
is that because we're cheap, 62 to 65 cents?
Yeah, that helps without doubt, and we've got enormous advantage in our products, our services. We're very well placed. It's hard, the tyranny of distance, supply chains, transport, all the issues that we have in Australia with getting things in and out cheaply and effectively and efficiently are ongoing areas of work. But I think we're always going to be a trade dependent, export oriented nation, so we just need to make the most of that.
So you talked about Singapore. Are we smart in the investments that we're placing bets on in terms of the likes of technology, etc., and the investment in that community?
Yeah, I believe so, and we rank highly in those areas. Perhaps don't, advertise that or promote that as much as we should. And I believe, and I know from experience in Singapore and Southeast Asia, that there may be misconceptions or misunderstandings, a lack of awareness about what we offer. And that, again, goes to Nicholas Moore's body of work. We need to better promote our capability because it's significant. And, investments into science, technology, digital trade, all these areas that Australia and Singapore have embraced, certainly in the time I was there, and notwithstanding a global pandemic and global recession. Perhaps because of that, we very nimbly, between our nations, looked to strengthening connections in those areas where we have enormous capability. So, we're trusted, we're reliable, we're capable partners. We just need to better promote that and reciprocate, as I say, by investing not only in places like Singapore, where it's relatively easy, but also other nations where not only can that help our economic prospects, but it can strengthen secure and stable region in Southeast Asia.
And if we waved the magic wand and said, well, I heard everything you said, but we've got this great job for you, Will. You're the leader of the opposition. What would you do? Because similar circumstances, he could be out for a while. All right. The word unelectable comes up, and now he's taken a focus on nuclear and is using that agenda to start a debate or a vision. What would you suggest or ask them to think through if you're in his shoes as federal opposition leader?
Yeah, and I don't mind that, asking serious questions about issues that are politically challenging. And I'd like to think we did that in opposition to play our role. It's not about opposing everything by any means, but by presenting alternatives. I think politics should be a genuine contest of ideas. And this is one area where I think we, and it's not just the political class, but also the media and perhaps Australians more generally, are prepared to shoot something down very, very quickly without thinking it through and looking at it. So I recognise the political challenges around a debate like the nuclear debate, but I think we should have it. We do ourselves a disservice if we don't. And I would hope, that some political courage and a willingness to explore issues like that doesn't disadvantage an opposition to the extent that they think, well, we won't bother doing that or we'll stay in opposition. I think that can be done, but you do have to be mindful and careful about how you do it. But I think ambition, not a tendency to risk aversion, ruling things out automatically without talking it through does our nation a disservice. So I would encourage the opposition to do more of that. As the next election looms, I think I'm always optimistic that there's a willingness to embrace that contest of ideas.
And does the opposition have the cut through?
Look, I think they do. And they certainly have the ability to do it. It's always, federal politics is a fast-moving contest. And, we're fast approaching another election. Unbelievably, it seems sometimes how quickly things turn. So I think a robust, look, I was in opposition for 12 years, 8 of them as leader. I'm, a firm believer and willing participant in robust parliamentary democracy and all its frustrations and its thorns and unpleasant parts. I think it's something to embrace. And I think I jest a little about Singapore because I think, you do need to have the honesty, the very robust nature of parliamentary democracy, test political leadership from time to time to get the very best out of it. But I think we just need to perhaps be a little more forgiving of political parties that are prepared to stick their neck up. And I just hope they don't get shot off.
Okay, now, many years ago, I think you said you travelled through the US. Well, half the world's going to an election this year. Obviously, the US is under the spotlight. What's your observations? Anything we can learn? What's your thoughts on where it's going to land?
Yeah, and I think the US is potentially a lesson in where we need to be very careful as well, because, the threat to democratic institutions through political leadership, but also through the media, is very real. And I think we need to be careful in Australia that if we go too far down that path, there'll be some very, very negative backwash, because, I'm a firm believer and practitioner and participant in our democratic institutions, and I hate to see them challenged or corrupted, whether it be through political leadership and elected leadership or through the role of the media. And I think of unscrupulous, media, which, is disruptive, perpetuates misinformation, instills a sense of hostility and distrust. What's happened in the US, is most unsatisfactory and unappealing. I'd hate to see that sort of stuff happen here.
And if you were to look back at that young man all those years ago, growing up at Hobart, going to school, you took him aside for a second, what advice would you give him now?
Yeah, I stayed in Tassie to finish my schooling, go to university, great university in Tassie, the law school, very well regarded. I was close to home. If I needed anything, mum and dad were 15 minutes away. Idyllic lifestyle, very safe and secure, as I've said before. And I was 17 when I started uni, so what was I to know? But I reckon, looking back, I'd say to myself, just be a little more open-minded to the big wide world, because it was only when I did go abroad through the States and then to the UK on my own, work overseas and see a less idyllic lifestyle and be exposed, I guess, more to the realities of life, did I appreciate there's a lot more to do. And I by no means do I feel dissatisfied or, feel unfulfilled in what I did post-university. Great education, great experience in the law in Tassie, thrown in the deep end, jack of all trades. I could have ended up, in a multinational in Melbourne or Sydney or overseas and been very much, in a machine, which would have been less satisfying in many respects. But I think perhaps just a willingness to cast off those bow lines and test yourself. And I did that later in life when we went to Singapore. As a pandemic engulfed the world, it was almost impossible to get in and out of the country. My wife and I, more Nikki, did 3 rounds of quarantine in hotels in Australia, 14 days in a locked room without a window opened, with our young daughter, just to get back in and see our kids. It was not easy for anyone who had to do that, and there are thousands of Australians across the world who felt a little cut off from our country. So to go to a really important foreign service post in Singapore, enormous steep learning curve for me, albeit with political skills, foreign policy and those things which I had less experience to. Great team I worked with in DFAT. We did it in the middle of a pandemic. Everyone was fearing for their lives and the safety of their loved ones across the world. We were isolated. We kept things together and ran a good ship and got a lot done, but it was very challenging and it tested us, and it as a family and and certainly me and Nikki as parents. But to your point, I think being prepared to take those risks, I'd say to my younger self, just give it a go. Anything's possible, and there's a big wide world out there, so go for it.
On that, Will, thank you very much for joining us today.
Absolute pleasure, Greg.
You have been listening to No Limitations.